Notice he said he was afraid. See, this verse, it falls within a story where Saul, this is Old Testament, he was a king of the nation Israel, and he was the person that God had blessed and appointed and given authority to say, hey, you're the king. But with all of this power, God also expected Saul to obey God's commands himself as an individual, but as king, Saul also was expected to not just obey God's commands, but to lead the people who followed him to also follow God's commands. Saul was to trust and obey God and to rule and lead people to do the same thing. And what we find in this one single verse, which is towards the end of his story, is we see that he's confessing his reason of why he did not obey. He said, I was afraid. I was afraid of the people. So not only did Saul disobey God's command because of his fear, but his disobedience, as you see it throughout the story, if you choose to go read it, is his disobedience actually led to the disobedience of the very people that he was supposed to be leading. And this is our focus for our tonight, fear. Because he was afraid, he had fear swelling up inside of him based on his circumstances and his situation. He was afraid. And we're talking about fear tonight, where last week we took a break and had a game night, and I hope you guys had a lot of fun. But we are still in our series, Disconnect, where we're talking about what happens up here in our mind and what happens within our heart, and how there's a disconnect between the two. The things that we feel, the things that we think, and the things that we even say that we believe. But when there's a disconnect between the two, it makes it hard for us to act rightly on those things. We've looked so far at two emotions, anger and sadness, and now we're focusing on fear. And I want to ask you guys, how many of you feel like you would admit that you have things that you're afraid of? Raise your hand if that's you. Wow, more people raising their hands than I thought. I honestly thought that it would be maybe a little difficult for you to admit that you're afraid of things. I expected y'all to have a mindset that would say, man, I'm not afraid of anything. That some of y'all will be real cocky and say, man, fear fears me. Something crazy like that. And with all due respect, if that is something that you think or a way that you feel, I would tell you that that's just not true. That's just not true. Maybe you don't go throughout your day regularly acknowledging, man, I'm afraid right now. I'm scared. This frightens me. This terrifies me. That might not be something that we regularly think about, but I think that at the core of our lives, within the challenges that we face, the pains that we endure, the different circumstances and sufferings that we find ourselves in, that fear is rooted within those things. And so to help us to try to get our ground with what we're talking about, I thought of some common scenarios that you might find yourself within. So let's start with this first one. Do you ever take pictures, and I say pictures because you're planning to post one, but you're just trying to find that right lighting and make that right face expression, that Justin Bieber lip pout? You're like, nah. You find yourself, you've got 37 pictures to choose from because you're trying to find the right one to post on Instagram or to send on Snapchat. But there's a thin line that goes between, hey, this one actually looks better because, yeah, the lighting is better. And I'm in that golden hour outside. But on the other side, you're afraid that whichever one you post, you just got to make sure that it gets the most likes. You're afraid that if it's not right, you won't be thought of as attractive or pretty or handsome. Or do you ever feel like you have to fill in the blank with whatever it is that you want? Whether that's, man, I feel like I have to get an A, or I feel like I have to score this many points, or I have to have this accomplishment, or I have to get this much done, or I have to make this much money, or I have to get accepted into this school, or I have to be part of this friend group, or this team, or this club. And all that pressure that builds up for you to do whatever it is that you're filling that blank in with, your pressure builds up. And it's nothing wrong with having goals and ambitions and saying, man, I want to accomplish these things. I want all A's. I want this GPA. I want to get accepted to this school. I want this job. I want to make this team. There's nothing wrong with those ambitions. But when it's so magnified in our face that we start to be afraid, man, if I don't achieve it, if I don't get accepted, if I don't make the team, if I don't get the grade, you're fearing it because you know that you'll feel worthless, that you won't feel loved or lovable. And that fear is actually driving and motivating you. That people won't think as highly of you if you are not as successful as you're aiming to be. Or how about one more? Do you ever find yourself with your friends and they're talking about doing something that you know your parents have explicitly forbade you from doing? Hey, don't go to this place. Don't do this thing. Stay away from these parties. Don't go drinking. Don't watch these movies. Don't go to these websites. But your friends are in a circle and they're talking about it and you know that you should stay away. But you have a little bit of a tendency inside of you to people please, as we call it, and say, man, I know I shouldn't, but I'm afraid that if I don't, they'll kick me out of the group. I'm afraid that if I don't partake, then they're going to call me lame, and I'll be the laughing stock of the school. What I'm saying is that these insecurities that we struggle with on a daily basis, all this worrying about what we look like, what we sound like, the worrying about who will accept us and bring us in and embrace us, the fears about what's going to happen tomorrow, all of it is related to fear, which is why I say that it's something that we all struggle with on a daily and regular basis. Our worries about tomorrow, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what other people think about us. I want to ask you, what does your fear look like? If you can take stock of yourself, I want to lead us to honestly examine ourselves. We've tried to do this with every message so far within this series, talking about anger, what makes you angry, talking about sadness, what makes you sad. I've tried to lead us in a moment to just reflect, to really hold a mirror up for ourselves and say, man, who am I in regards to this question? What am I afraid of? And I want to be clear that we're not necessarily talking about something like clinical anxiety or maybe a phobia that you've been diagnosed with, although those things and situations and diagnoses certainly have relevance to what we are talking about, but they have some other components as well. And I hope that if that is you, that you're still listening. But it is worth saying that the fear that we are talking about usually involves us being concerned about something that we cannot necessarily control. Something that we want to have power over, something that we want to determine the outcome. We want to manage the results. We want to make sure that we get this many likes or that we get this many people inviting us or we get this many schools saying, yes, you're accepted. We want to control these things and we're afraid that we don't have the power to. And so we're trying to find whatever areas that we can control and say, man, you know what? I'm so worried that I won't get into these schools, so let me have all of these cram sessions as I'm studying for my SAT. Let me make sure that I'm, drinking coffee after coffee after coffee to make sure that I can stay awake, to cram as much knowledge in my head as I can so that I can pass this test. Let me go and make sure that I'm doing whatever it is that they're doing so that I can feel accepted, because I'm afraid that I'm going to feel lonely if they kick me out of their friend group. So I'm going to do the very thing that my parents have told me not to do. When we're taking and retaking those pictures, we want to control the response on social media. Again, in and of themselves, taking pictures, trying to find the right lighting, trying to study, trying to practice or rehearse so that we can be the best that we can be, that's not bad. And even wanting to have fun within our circles of friends is not a bad desire. But what we see in the story of Saul, even though we only looked at one single verse, is that fear can motivate us. Fear can motivate us. And I'm glad that most of you did raise your hand saying, yeah, I get afraid sometimes. But are you self-aware enough to know moment by moment when fear is rising inside of you tempting you to do something that you would not necessarily do if you weren't afraid. Hour by hour throughout the day, as you're engaging in different conversations with your friends, are you aware of when fear is starting to motivate you to say something, motivating you to say something a certain way, that you change up your slang that you use depending on who's around, because you're thinking, man, in front of this crowd, I need to sound like them, but in front of that crowd, I need to sound like them. So I go from, hey man, what's happening, to, yeah, hey guys, how you doing? We're switching up, afraid that we're going to lose a certain friend group. Fear can motivate us, and if we're not careful in how we respond to our fear, which means that we first have to acknowledge it in the moment, but if we're not careful of how we respond to it, then it can lead us to sin, just like it did Saul. See, our fear, our worries over all of these things that are beyond our control can cause us to do things that God is not pleased with, all in an effort to control our circumstances, to control others and their opinions of us, and sometimes even in an effort to control our feelings. We will go above and beyond to try to manage and control what we can. So I think the right question for us to ask ourselves is, well, what do we do with our fears then? All right? And understand this is not a once and for all solution that any of these messages are trying to provide. It's just trying to start the conversation that you'll live the rest of your lives dealing with anger, dealing with sadness, dealing with fear. And hopefully each time that we're getting together and you're sitting under these teachings, you're sitting in your connect groups, you're getting more and more tools and ideas of things that you can do to manage these emotions. But more importantly, that you're seeing the God who cares for you and that is saying, hey, bring those emotions to me. Hopefully your relationship with him, your faith and trust in him is growing each time that you're sitting in these seats. But in this moment, let's consider, man, what do we do with our fear? And if you remember from the previous messages, we've always said, okay, we don't want to just tell you what not to do when you're angry or when you're sad. Don't punch a hole in the wall. Don't yell. Don't curse. We don't want to just tell you what not to do. We've tried to also tell you what to do with your emotions. Embracing that, hey, you can find a safe space, and that hopefully your youth leaders here, hopefully at home, your parents or your guardians, your guidance counselors at school, hopefully they are tangible, safe spaces through which you can experience God as your safe space, but that you even can go to him and bring him your cares, your worries, your anger, your sadness, whatever emotion you're feeling, and embrace him as a safe space directly. And hopefully all of that is bringing you in, but in our process of trying to identify these tools, we've always looked at Jesus and said, well, what did Jesus do when he felt that emotion? What did Jesus do when he felt angry? What did Jesus do when he felt sad? And we would look at a passage in the Bible and say, okay, well, right here we see that Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the English Bible. We looked at that. We looked at the moments of Jesus being angry within our connect groups. And maybe you talked about a different story in your group from what my group talked about. But we've looked at these things, and it can feel right and normal to say, well, let's look at Jesus being afraid in the Bible. And that was my plan. Until I started to look and do research and study and realize, man, there is no point in the Bible that we see Jesus being afraid. No point in the Bible do we see Jesus confessing to his disciples or Jesus praying, saying, God, I'm terrified. God, I'm scared. God, I'm afraid. We don't see that. And that might sound a little bit discouraging because it's like, well, man, if Jesus didn't do anything, then I can't follow his example. But I would actually argue the other end of it, the opposite, that actually the fact that we don't see Jesus being afraid should encourage us, because it means that Jesus was not afraid. That Jesus was fully human. And what we see in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says, this high priest of ours, that is Jesus, it says that Jesus understands our weaknesses. For Jesus, he faced all of the same testings that we do, yet he did not sin. That means Jesus understands our weaknesses. He understands what we're going through. He understands our struggles. And I used to read this verse and think, man, that means that Jesus actually experienced all the things that I experienced. But that's actually not quite what it means. Because again, if it did, then most likely we would see, oh, here's a verse that shows Jesus being afraid. At least we could assume so. But I think that what this actually means is that Jesus knows what it's like to be in need. A few months ago, we had our sermon series and we were talking about how Jesus is fully God and fully man. It's not 50-50. He's fully 100% God. He's fully 100% man. And in his humanity, he knew what it was like to be hungry. He knew what it was like to be thirsty. And when he was going through this process of approaching his crucifixion, he was being mocked, being joked on, being ridiculed, but he was also being whipped. He was being flogged. He was brutally beaten beyond recognition, where you would look at him and not even be able to tell that that was Jesus. This is the suffering that Jesus endured. People laughed in his face. He was pierced. Nails were driven in his hands and in his feet. He was stabbed in his side. Jesus knew what it was like to need healing. Jesus knew what it was like to need relief from his suffering. And Jesus knew what it was like to need comfort. Jesus can understand our weaknesses. He understands what it's like for us to be in need, because in his humanity, he experienced that, but yet he did it all without fear. That even as Jesus was approaching this time, we see time and time again in the scriptures where Jesus would go off to pray. And one setting in particular, in this garden, Jesus is praying to God, and it almost sounds like he's afraid. It almost sounds like he's scared. But out of his mouth, he's crying out to God, saying, God, take this cup of suffering, this cup of your wrath, take it from me if it's your will. Well, he's saying, God, I don't want to have to do this. I know this is going to hurt. I know this is going to be the worst thing that I can experience on this earth. He recognizes it all. But rather than saying, God, I'm scared, I'm shaking in my boots, and that's not knocking us when we're afraid, but I'm just saying that didn't come out of Jesus' mouth. Instead, what he said to God is, God, take it from me, but nonetheless, God, have your way. Let your will be done, God, not mine. You do what you want to do, God, even if it means that the suffering that I have to go through, even if it comes on me and it hurts, it's painful, it's exhausting, and I don't deserve it at all. Jesus welcomed that. Something that you and I would certainly be afraid of and say, oh, man, not only do I not want that, but God, I'm going to run away from it. Jesus said, no, I don't want it, God, and I'm asking you to take it from me. But God, if it's what you want to happen, bring it on. Bring it on. What we see through this is that Jesus, instead of being afraid, Jesus had the boldness and the bravery to go through and face this suffering. And the reason why is because Jesus fully trusted God. Jesus fully knew God. He fully knew that God was wise and that God was sovereign, that God had all the power over the world, that God was the creator of the heavens and the earth and everything within it. That's what the Bible says in Genesis. God had all the power and the control over everything that he experienced in this life. And so Jesus said, God, since you're in control of all of this, you have the power to make me not have to go through it. You have that power, God. But Jesus also knew that God is good. That God is good. So Jesus was trusting God, saying, I know you've got the power, so if you can, take this from me. But God, if you don't, I'm trusting that because you're so good, that even if you make me have to go through this suffering, even if people beat me, mock me, whip me, flog me, place a crown of thorns on my head, stab me and pierce me, even if, God, you allow this to happen, you're good, so you're allowing the suffering to happen, for your glory, for my good, and the good of many others. That's the faith that Jesus had. So he said, you know what, God? Because I fully know that you have all the power, but because I also know that you are fully good, that God, I can fully rest and trust in whatever it is that you allow to happen in my life. I can trust you. I can trust your will for me, your plans for me. Instead of being afraid in what was going to happen, Jesus trusted in what God would do and allowed to be done to him because he trusted in who God is. Jesus fully knew God. And the beauty of his story is that he died so that you can know him too. Where if you're a follower of Jesus in here, you're never going to live out the example of Jesus, his life, that what we see him do, you're never going to live it out perfectly. You're never going to be without fear completely. I'm not going to tell you, man, when you become a Christian, you're not going to be afraid ever again. That's not true. That's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible doesn't say, hey, life is going to get easier. Life is going to get better and be peaches and cream, and it's going to be sweet and smooth. You won't struggle. You won't suffer. You won't feel pain. That's not what the Bible tells us at all. It actually says the opposite. You're going to face challenges. You're going to suffer. You're going to endure pain in this thing that we call life. But the beauty is that not only does God give us that warning, but through Jesus' life, ministry, his death and resurrection, and his promises, he gave us his Holy Spirit, we see that Jesus is saying, I'm with you through it all. Where now we have the Holy Spirit living within us, where, again, we're not going to be perfect, we're not going to be without fear, and we're not going to be perfect to manage our fear in the way that Jesus didn't have to do because he was never afraid, but we're not going to respond in the perfect way, but yet, at the same time, we can be encouraged that with Jesus, we are able to respond with the faith that he had. That Jesus has died to give us access to the Father within a relationship with him where we can come to him and say, just like he did, I don't want to go through this. God, I'm so afraid that my family's about to fall apart, that my mom and dad are about to get divorced. I'm so afraid that my friends are about to leave me. That my closest friend is moving away and I'm going to be alone. I'm so afraid that I won't make the team. I'm so afraid that I won't get into the school that I want to get into. I'm so afraid that people won't accept me, that we can cry out and say, God, just take it all away. Make it better. Snap your fingers. Do whatever you got to do, God, and just make the situation better. But that we can still trust him just like Jesus did and say, but God, even if it's not your plan, let your will be done. Because you're good. By the power of Jesus, we cannot control the circumstances of life, but we can control how we respond to our fear. So I want to give us three practical things that I see within the Bible that we can hopefully apply, try our best to. And again, we're not going to be perfect at it, but I believe that we see Jesus living this out within his faith and trust in God himself. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, it says, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. This is a verse that I've brought into our Wednesday nights time and time again. I probably need to get it written on my tongue because of just how much it speaks to me within the things that I'm afraid of. I would raise my hand. I'm fearful in life. I'm fearful of what you think of me. Fearful of what my wife and my kids think of me. Fearful of what my parents think of me. These things run through my mind and through my heart. But this verse comforts me, where it's inviting us to confess our fear. God is saying, whatever it is that you're worried about, it doesn't matter how big it seems to you, trust that I'm bigger. It doesn't matter how small it seems to you, trust that I love you and care about you enough to say, I welcome it. Give it to me. There'll be challenges that we face, insecurities that we struggle with, opinions that we want to change and control, people that we want to please. But God's invitation is for us to give those things to him. And when Saul faced that challenge, again, we only looked at one verse because it speaks a lot, when Saul faced that challenge, he felt insecure. The other scriptures actually say that he felt unimportant in life, like sometimes we feel. I admit that. But he wanted to make sure that even though he felt unimportant, he was saying, I want to control what other people think about me. And that's why he was afraid. So he disobeyed God and said, I'm going to do what they want because I want to make sure that they love me, instead of giving it to God. Point number 2, Psalm 56, verse 3, it says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. I was talking with Miss Carla. She said that this is one of her favorite verses. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. It's, again, saying you're going to be afraid. We're not going to hide it. We're not going to try to pretend that we're not. It's saying when that moment comes tonight, when that moment comes tomorrow, when that moment comes, then I'm afraid the next day. When I fear God, I put my trust in you. It's something that I do. It's something that I will do. It's something that I will do again. I will put my trust in you. Where the first point, that first verse is saying, hey, confess it to God, bring it to him, cry out to him, tell God, hey, this is how I feel. I'm afraid of this. God, I'm afraid of that. But technically, you can complain to God. You can cry out to him and walk away without trusting him. It's like talking at a wall. God, I'm mad about this. And then you walk away, but nothing else happens. The second point is saying, after you complain to God, after you bring whatever it is that's on your mind and heart, choose to trust God. Choose to trust him. Choose to put your trust in him. We bring him the problems, but we don't walk away. We sit there and say, God, this is what I'm afraid of. But God, I remember that you're wise. I remember that you're all-powerful, that you can do something about it. And I remember that you're good. So I'm going to trust in that. And then the last verse, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. It says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. After confessing to God our fear, after choosing to trust God, we commit to faithfulness. We say, God, I'm choosing to trust in you. But because I'm choosing to trust in you, I'm going to remember that I have your spirit living inside of me, so I don't have to, my fear might be motivating me to do this, but God, I'm going to choose to trust you, and I'm going to commit to do that. That which will trust you. That which will walk in faith. That which will act in the belief that you're good. I will do what you want me to do, God, even though I'm afraid, because I'm trusting you through it all.